Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's event, the museum's third annual Pride Celebration. I'm Jenny Frankel, the Associate Director of the Museum of Public Relations. When we held our first Pride event in 2019, it was the first time that the industry came together to publicly honor the great contributions of our fellow LGBTQ professionals. It was the first time that the issues of being gay, bi, trans, or queer in PR were allowed in an open forum to talk about experiences of bias, exclusion, and outright discrimination in the workplace. We learned how far we had come as a profession, and especially how far we needed to go to provide the LGBT community a home in this industry. It was a moving, emotional event for the panelists and audience alike, a real milestone in the course of PR history. Tonight, we expect will be equally moving. We'll be hearing from two panels, one made up of PR professionals and one made up of journalists. Many of these panelists have never spoken in a public forum like this before. They'll be moderated by the legendary Kathy Renna, Communications Director of the National LGBTQ Task Force, who has spent years using her skills in PR to advocate on behalf of the LGBTQ community. In fact, few people have done more to educate the general public about the community and to educate fellow members of the community how to advocate for themselves. This special event would not be possible without the generous support of our sponsors, which include the Bonnie Yablon Foundation, Grady College of Journalism and Mass Communications Department of Advertising and Public Relations at University of Georgia, the IW Group, Page, Johnson & Johnson, Consumer Health and OGX, Finn Partners, Pat Ford, Mike Worldwide, Orange County Gay Men's Chorus Group, also known as Men Alive, the University of Oregon School of Journalism and Communication, Compro, and Muckrack. A warm thank you as well to our partners on this event, the Diversity Action Alliance and PRCA. Before I hand the mic to Kathy, I'd like to share that we'll be holding a surprise halftime program tonight. We want to thank in advance the Gay Men's Chorus of Orange County, as well as Dr. Veiling Shah for making tonight's performance possible. Now, I'd like to bring on Kathy Renna to talk about tonight's program and introduce our keynote speaker.
Well, welcome everyone to the Museum of PR annual Pride event. This is the third event. I am so thrilled and honored to be back and hosting. Can't wait for the panels with both my colleagues in PR and communications, and then an incredible panel with journalists working in LGBT and mainstream media to talk about what the last year has been like and what's going on now in terms of LGBTQ issues, media coverage, and how we can better tell our stories. But first, we have something very, very special. I am so pleased and honored to introduce a colleague, a friend, Stephanie Battaglino. She's an author, an advocate. She has been an incredible, incredible voice for the trans community, both in the corporate world, but also in the larger culture. She serves on many, many boards, but she is currently serving on the National Board of PFLAG, Parents, Friends, and Family of LGBTQ People, a national advocacy and support organization for families with LGBTQ family members and friends. Please welcome Stephanie.
Telling my story. That's how it all began for me after becoming the first transgender person to successfully transition in the 160-year history of the New York Life Insurance Company back in 2005. It is quite simply the through line to everything related to the journey to my authentic self, to the person that I've always known myself to be. In the lead up to my coming out, for every person that I shared my true self with, I did so by telling a story in the hope of making who I am as accessible as I could to their unknowing ears. I did so somewhat naively, not knowing how it would land, despite my attempts at fashioning it as authentically as I could. It's the only way I knew how. For my entire life, telling a story had always been my default mode of communication. It's what I always did, most of the time without even thinking. It was how I pursued a human connection, how I went about getting people to like me, and hopefully not see the real me hidden behind the facade of maleness I was desperately trying to keep in place. Telling my story helped me hide the real me from everyone around me. All of those stories, mostly real, and some, I must admit, that were fabricated for the time, the place, and the audience, all seemed to work at keeping my deep, dark secret from the world throughout 4+ decades of shame, guilt, and denial. So it should come as a bit of a surprise, perhaps, that when it came time for me to give back, to pay it forward, I wasn't exactly sure how to go about it. Well, I was quick to point out to the HR vice presidents at New York Life that I may be the first, but I won't be the last. I had no idea about how I would go about creating a path for others to follow. What perhaps I didn't fully realize in that moment was that I was taking on a responsibility to do everything I could to make it easier for those who were to come after me, whether they be at my company or at any other company. It would require me to create space on my shoulders for those who would follow me, just as I stood on the shoulders of my trans sisters who came before me. People like Maggie Stump, who, as an executive at Prudential, had come out a year or so before I did. Her story and how it was spread through the media of that time gave me the courage I needed to overcome my fears and pursue my dream. I felt a strong desire within myself to do the same, but I was at a loss as to how. I struggled with what it was that I could bring to the trans inclusion conversation. What was my angle? How could I best position myself to be heard amidst what seemed like a cacophony of much more compelling voices? But then, through perhaps more than a little divine intervention, I received two particularly important pieces of advice that, taken together, formed a seminal moment for me. The first came from a friend of mine who at the time was a leader at a national LGBTQ organization. In responding to my question, but is there room in the sandbox for me? He said quite pointedly, Stephanie, it's not a sandbox. It's more like a beach. And the second came from another trans woman who had already achieved some measure of notoriety with a book of her own, who said to me, all you have to do is tell your story. These honest and authentic answers instantaneously impacted me. Suddenly, I realized that my own story, however mundane and run of the mill it may have seemed to me, wasn't mundane or run of the mill at all, and that there was a place for it in the ever expanding constellation of voices that were already out there calling for equality and inclusion for all transgender people. What I have learned every day since is that there is immense power in our stories. They truly change hearts and minds. They connect us as human beings because they have the unique ability to tap into our shared humanity. And it is precisely this shared humanity that is our greatest common denominator. But it is not just the stories of other LGBTQ individuals that add to this collective voice. It is also the stories of our allies, those that stand in solidarity with us and urge others to join our fight to be heard. They are equally, if not more important, than our own. Their stories of love and support for the LGBTQ people in their lives create space for others to step up and do the same. For the last 7 years, I have been privileged to serve on the board of PFLAG National and have witnessed firsthand the incredible power that a parent's love for their LGBTQ child can create. Look at it this way. It's if we're all standing on the shore of a mountain lake and it's very quiet and it's very still. The lake surface is like glass. And then suddenly it starts to rain. And each drop of rain that hits the glass like lake creates a ripple. And then another drop hits, and another ripple, and another drop, and another ripple. And suddenly, all of these ripples begin to multiply and intersect. You are that single drop of rain because that ripple that you create is that circle of people, that inner circle of people that are closest to you, Those are the individuals that, as you stand up and be an ally for my community and the greater LGBTQ community, you influence the most. So if you're doing that, and another person is doing that, and another person is doing that at the same time, we then have a movement and we create the change that we seek. And that's where each one of you come in today. By amplifying our stories and those of our allies, you are creating even more ripples. And make no mistake, each one of those ripples contributes to the movement, to the greater good. By proudly proclaiming your support and allyship, you are sending a powerful message to your employees, to your clients, to your business partners, and to your customers that equality for all is a major priority. But the question I put before you is this: are you and the company that you represent an ally with a capital A or an ally with a small a? Capital A allies are visible, engaged in our history and our issues, and embrace teaching moments when they encounter them. Small a allies just talk a good game and wave their pride flags around for the month of June and then put them back in their desk drawer for the other 11 months of the year. They acquiesce when conflict arises, and they shy away rather than lean in to the difficult conversation. Make no mistake, we are at an inflection point for the LGBTQ community, and in particular, the transgender community. We need all the capital A allies we can get because we cannot fight this battle for equality and inclusion alone. Our very authenticity is under attack. While this has certainly happened before, think back to North Carolina's bathroom bill in 2016, it has now taken on a particularly hate-filled and hurtful turn. The opposition has taken direct aim on the most vulnerable of my community, trans kids and trans athletes, many of whom are of middle school and high school ages. At last count, some 37 or so bills have been introduced across 20 state legislatures. And in 9 states, these have been signed into law, banning transgender girls and women from participating in school sports consistent with their gender identity. The latest happened at the very beginning of Pride Month, on June 1st to be exact, in Florida. Big surprise. And as you all well know, that timing was not by accident. But trans youth are fighting back by living their truth and telling their stories. Voices like Stella Keating, who bravely testified before the Senate on behalf of the Equality Act. They're sharing their challenges, they're sharing their hopes, and they're sharing their fears so that society can get an honest picture of what it's like to be a young trans person in today's America. They are courageous, they are brave, they are resilient, and they are my heroes. And that is why, among other things, I decided to write my book. I am proud to share my stories with the world in the hope that it can raise up the many in my community that feel that they do not have a voice, for they all have a right and a need to be heard. And that's why I think it is right for precisely this moment in time that the transgender community finds itself in. One of the key post-transition themes that I write about is around my experience with male privilege. For 25 years of my corporate life, I had it, but I didn't really think much of it. But when I made the decision to embrace my true self and live my life authentically, it vanished in an instant. All that power that I possessed throughout my climb up the corporate ladder was gone, and its loss cut like a knife. Many of you possess great privilege. I'm speaking directly to the straight and gay white males in the room. How are you going to use this fight for equality for underrepresented communities like mine? We need you. And to be clear, it is not a zero-sum game. Share your knowledge. Share your value. Share your network. And share your own story. Because as you lift us up, you elevate the entire LGBTQ community in the process. So in closing, I ask each of you here to consider these questions. What is your responsibility as public relations and communications professionals to amplify these voices and raise up these conversations? What will you do to mirror the courageousness of my younger trans siblings in combating the onslaught of misinformation and disinformation designed to eradicate their existence? What will you do to shape the narrative around equality and inclusion, not just for the transgender and non-binary community, but for LGBTQ persons everywhere within your cultures and within your community? I ask each of you, what will be your story? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, for that. Stephanie's going to stay with us and we'll be able to answer some questions. I am absolutely thrilled to bring on our panel of PR and comms professionals. So if we can have my colleagues join us. Great. So I'm just absolutely thrilled with the folks that we have brought together. They are peers, they are colleagues, they are inspirations, they are mentors, they are friends. They're folks I've known a very long time and some that I don't know very well at all, but we're all in the fight together. And I'm so excited to have this conversation. I'm going to have them sort of introduce themselves with the first question. And I'll pick an order. So the first question is really just tell us a little bit about your journey to how you got to where you are now in PR and what you're focused on now. And I will go ahead and start with my longtime friend and colleague, Ben Finzel.
How did I know you would do that, Kathy? Hi, everybody. It's great to be here, and it's a real honor. And I'm just thrilled that Shelley and Jenny and team have started the Museum of PR. It's something we really need in our industry, and it's great to see that you've brought us all together to talk tonight. So I am the president of Renew PR. It is a boutique consultancy. I started in 2015. We do energy, environment, public affairs, and I also added LGBTQ communications. So that's part of my story, to pick up on Stephanie's words. And that really is focused on work I did launching FH Out Front, which was the first global LGBTQ communications practice at an international PR firm in 2004, which means I'm old. I also founded DC Family Communicators in 2018. That's a professional networking group for LGBTQ comms folks in DC. And in 2019, I joined with 5 other agencies to form the Change Agencies, which is the first national network of independently owned multicultural and LGBTQ comms firms. That's a little bit about my journey, and I'm thrilled to be here and ready to talk to folks.
Thank you so much, Ben. So let's take it to you, Stephen Macias, my GLAAD alum colleague. Tell us what your journey's been and tell us a little bit about what you're working on, because you're always doing great stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, Kathy. Well, it started in a 1600 watt radio station in Fresno. Kidding, but I'm from Fresno. One of the things that I have been able to do is marry my passion and purpose with my professional career, with the help and guidance and North Stars of all of the folks that are on this call and many more across the country. I'm currently the Executive Vice President of Rogers & Cowan PMK, which is one of the many agencies owned by Interpublic Group across the world. I founded the multicultural and LGBTQ practice here at Rogers & Cowan PMK. Prior to that, I founded the diversity inclusion practice at MWW, also known as now as Mike Worldwide, which is one of our sponsors today. So I've had a comms career in the agency world for about a decade, but as Kathy mentioned, we were also peers and colleagues on the 2 separate coasts, from news to entertainment at GLAAD. I have been fortunate enough to serve on many boards, from the task force to the Gay Men's Chorus of Los Angeles, and really spent quite a bit of my formative years in understanding the LGBTQ space when I was running the Advocate Out magazine and HIV Plus magazine, which was then called Here Media. So a lot of what we do here every day is obviously professional, but it is fueled by passion and purpose, and I'm very grateful to be here. So thank you very much, Kathy.
Thank you, Stephen. One of the most amazing organizations in the queer community is PFLAG. And we are so very, very blessed to have Liz Owen with us tonight. So Liz, can you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what's going on at PFLAG?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And Liz Owen, she, her, are my pronouns. And thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this incredible panel and this incredible evening with all of these people, the ones here and the ones coming up soon, and to Stephanie. I have a history getting to the job that I'm in that seems on paper to make no sense whatsoever. I didn't study PR. I was an actor for years. From stage acting, I moved into film production and was working on a variety of independent projects. And my husband at the time, this is going back a long time, my husband at the time and I bought a house, and I decided I should get a job doing something that would pay the bills, that was like a permanent job as I was trying to sell these projects. And maybe I should get a job in a space where I could learn something that I didn't know anything about. And I got a job in marketing and PR at Paramount Pictures. Started as an assistant and just fell in love with publicity and communications, just absolutely. And I did have a history working with nonprofits, mission, and like the marriage of mission and media has always been my absolute passion. So I was at Paramount for a long time, was an assistant, then became a publicist, and for a variety of reasons left that job. And my very first gig as a solo practitioner was working as a publicist, first as the unit publicist, then to the national release of this LGBTQ independent film called True Loved. And one of the things we did was partner with a bunch of major national organizations, one of which was PFLAG, which is how I first got connected with PFLAG. And flash forward a few years later, they were looking for a director of communications, and I decided the time had come to leave solo practitionership, which is now a word. And I applied for the job and got it, and that was 11 years ago. I adore this organization. I adore this job. And I just feel very, very lucky to be working in this space, especially, like I said, coming through such a circuitous route. It really was the right place at the right time, and I'm so glad I've been able to stay here.
And I'm sure you'll start telling us a little bit more about what PFLAG's working on when I ask about politics. Because boy,
You bet.
doing a lot of work right now, as many of us are, and really doing incredible work. And speaking of incredible work, Christopher with NCLR, you're up.
Thanks, Kathy. I want to echo what everybody said. I feel very honored to be here today. I believe I'm probably the newest to this this group, but I feel extreme pride to be with you all today, and especially with the Museum of PR. I will also echo what Liz said, and I have a very circuitous route of how I got to be the communications director for the National Center for Lesbian Rights. And I apologize, my pronouns are he, him. I did not say that before. I started with my, I started actually as a student journalist when I was 15, 16 in high school, and really loved it. I thought the power of journalism and writing and being able to tell stories and get things done was really important. And I was also very much a muckraker and into, uncovering stuff that was going on. But at the same time, I was also becoming an activist. Joined the ACLU when I was 16 because I very much believed in, the power of the press to get information out and everything like that, and civil liberties. But at the same time, I was also coming to terms with being a queer youth. So I actually got started with my queer activism when I was only 16 years old, doing some lobbying work with Equality California back in Orlando, which ended up becoming a very large public outing for me through much of the national press. And it ended up driving me into a place where I wanted to be an activist, but I also wanted to do this writing. And I thought, where could I marry some of this thoughts, or how could I turn this into a career? And I was like, oh, public relations seems like a good way to do that, or to get into the door to do that and do spokesperson work or anything like that. So I actually went down to the University of Miami, got a degree in public relations and political science, because I thought that was also the perfect marriage of what I wanted to do. But then funny enough, I never went into PR. Unlike some of the people on this panel, I've never actually practiced traditional PR. I left college and went to intern for the first gay excuse me, the first openly gay city councilman in Phoenix, Arizona. And then after that, spent a few years there figuring out where I wanted to go and made it to San Francisco. When I got up here, I've been doing a bunch of marketing and PR work for smaller companies. I should just say marketing, it wasn't real PR. But at the same time, I was interning for a lot of, or interning or volunteering for a lot of different organizations. I actually am part of the GLAAD family as well, helped run the local GLAAD chapter here in San Francisco, worked with the AIDS Foundation and the San Francisco LGBT Center. But I fell into NCLR because my former roommate, who was a city supervisor here, was just obsessed with them. I think everybody that lives in San Francisco was obsessed with NCLR because of the history of them being in the city for 40 years, and then also everybody's love of Kate Kendall, who had been at the helm of NCLR for 2 decades. And so about 1.5 years ago, I had just finished my master's in public administration, and I thought I was going to go into a government job, and I saw this opening for communications director, and it was in the midst of the Trump White House era, and I was like, I need to do something that's good for my community, and I'm going to apply for this. And I unlikely got it, and it's been a roller coaster for 1.5 years, but I've loved it every moment of it.
Thanks, Christopher. We are so glad to have you in our world. You do great work, and NCLR is an amazing partner, working with the task force, working with PFLAG and so many other organizations. And last and certainly not least, Justin Bookbinder is with us. Justin, do you want to tell us a little bit about your journey?
Yeah, thanks so much, Kathy. Justin Bookbinder, he, him. And my journey is an interesting one because none of it was planned, right? I mean, I grew up as, I came out of the closet at age 15 to my parents. I was very fortunate and very lucky to have parents that immediately supported me, joined PFLAG, and had a really wonderful experience that way. And that was never really one of my challenges, but I did feel very alone all the same. I was gay in the pre-2000s. I didn't know anyone else who was gay. I felt very alone. I got to college and met a few more people who were gay and started to get a sense of community. But it wasn't until LiveJournal and Xanga appeared that I started to see stories and hear about other gay people living in other places, to realize that it wasn't just this small clan of people like me that I had found. And then one day social media came into being and everything changed. And it was this magical place. And yes, of course, there's negative parts of social media as well, but it gave me an opportunity to meet more people and understand a world beyond just my own neighborhood, my own town, my own city. And then I just surfed it. I surfed social media. I found my way through different agencies, found my way into being a LGBTQ consultant for marketing, for businesses and nightclubs and production companies. And ultimately it landed me here now, where I work as the director of paid and organic social media at Fin Partners. We're a global integrated marketing agency, over 800 people strong and growing every single day. And on the side, to keep up with my connection to social media, I'm also a pro bono consultant for social media marketing for LGBTQ organizations still, because I feel like it's an incredible tool that completely changed my life and how I viewed others and how I viewed life in general. And I think it's something that everyone needs to tap into and get out there, not just for connection, but also to advance the important things that they're doing.
Thank you so much. And sorry, I neglected to say before, my pronouns are she, her, hers. So I want to jump right in to what's going on in the world right now. And any of you, please jump in and respond. But we're living in something of a different world, right? The landscape has changed tremendously. We had Pride at the White House on Friday, which we have not had for more than a few years. But we're also in a very politically charged climate, and we're facing, as Stephanie spoke about, hundreds literally of anti-trans bills in particular. And also we're fighting to pass the Equality Act through Congress. So I'd love to hear how the folks, not just the nonprofit folks, but really any of you, are working within this new, very challenging, sometimes paradoxical, interesting environment.
Go ahead, Stephen.
No, after you.
Oh, I mean, I think for PFLAG, the critical piece is the sharing of personal stories. I mean, I think Justin touched on this really beautifully, like reading stories made a difference, right? Hearing from people that maybe sounded like you or gave hope or talked about struggle. And, stories really do change hearts and minds. And, for PFLAG, for example, working on the Equality Act, so much opposition is regarding people of faith, right? We hear the opposition, it's people of faith, people. Well, that opposition doesn't corner the market on faith, right? There are plenty of parents of queer kids who are Christian parents, who are Muslim parents, who are Jewish. I mean, name a faith tradition and you will find a parent of a queer kid to tell a story somewhere in the world. And those stories are critical. And I think especially, like, yes, the New York Times, the big outlets are really important, but are you reaching the small markets? Are you reaching the small local newspapers where maybe people don't have digital connection, but they do pick up the local rag at their local market? And maybe it's more conservative or movable middle readers who are like, I didn't realize my neighbor had a trans kid. Oh, that kid is in the choir with my kid. I didn't even know that. And all of a sudden you're connected with a neighbor and you didn't know they had a story and what the Equality Act would mean for your neighbor. I think those pieces of this work are really critical.
I think one of the things that has become a major focal point for the work that we do in connecting large brands to diverse audiences in marketing, film, and television is helping our clients understand the intersectionality of our identities. So that, to your point, Liz, about, where you'll find us in every home, in every neighborhood, in every state, in every religion, so forth and so on. I think one of the things that has been, an effective tool in dividing Americans across decades, probably since the Southern strategy, that particular election, is, dividing people based on race, as opposed to the commonalities of issues that affect us at different places across the country. So I think for us, helping our clients understand what it means to walk out your front door as a woman of color who's also trans, what that means as it relates to the safety to picking up a gallon of milk, a pair of shoes, applying for a job, the things that sometimes we take for granted. So I think that's been one of the exciting things about the shift in the administrative focus, is that it's allowed us more space to broaden the conversation for a broader impact to actually address issues that are meaningful and real. I think the unfortunate thing in the sort of amongst the many unfortunate things in these bills that are being introduced that are attacking our most vulnerable is the additional impact that it takes our energy away from other things that we all have a common challenge with. Our environment here in California, we are baking. It is, if there's a drought, we have very little conversation happening over the past 4 years about real environmental change because we've been fighting for our lives again, literally. And so one of the things that I'm excited about as we move forward into this year is having a broader range of conversations that impact people, looking towards expanding and maintaining our civil rights so that we can use just a little bit of our bandwidth and our energy to focus on those issues that affect all of our communities around healthcare, around education, and the environment.
Just to add to that, I agree with everything both Liz and Stephen said. I think for me, it's two things. One is do the work, and two is show the work. So doing the work, I've had the opportunity to work with Family Equality, for example, on the John Lewis Every Child Deserves a Family Act, which is legislation focused on making sure that people who look like me, people who look like Stephanie, people who look like everyone on this call actually have the ability to start a family. And that's something that is not enshrined in law right now. And so getting to do that work and help organizations like Family Equality really talk about that has been really meaningful and also a lot of fun, despite the world we're living in, as we've just heard. But the second piece of that, which is something I've learned over the years and have not been able to always do, is to show the work. And what I mean by that is intersectionality among your client base, so that my clients who may be focused on one of the energy environment issues I work on around climate actually also see the work I'm doing on LGBT work, and they actually see the whole me, and they understand what's important to me as their public relations partner. So I'm now seeing clients, and one of the CEOs of one of the large companies I work for is retweeting me on Twitter when I'm tweeting about LGBT issues, which is not only personally affirming, but really what we need to do as we think about being PR practitioners and really engaging our clients, not in walling off certain things we do, but in really being our whole selves at work, and bringing that to the table and really talking about the work we do and having clients see that, even if it isn't what they're paying us to do, because that's really how we get the dialogue going and the conversations going. And it's really been an amazing thing to be able to do after working in 5 PR firms that had other people's names on them, to get to do that now that it's not my name, but it's my firm. It's really a wonderful thing, and something that I'm learning as I go is being that much more helpful.
So a lot of these battles are fought in the courts, not just, we deal with the court of public opinion, but they're also fought in the courts. And one of our leading legal organizations is NCLR. So Christopher, can you talk a little bit about the work that you all are doing regarding both the state level bills and also around the Equality Act?
Yeah, absolutely. So as one of the longest term LGBTQ legal organizations, we've been involved with a lot of the cases. Our legal director, Shannon Mentor argued the California marriage equality case in front of the California Supreme Court. We also had marriage equality clients during the Obergefell out of Tennessee, and lots of stuff. And the legal landscape does look a little bit different and a little bit better for LGBTQ individuals, particularly after the last year's Bostock ruling, which we've seen be implemented in ways that nobody saw coming at first. Under the Trump administration, they were using every means to create discrimination against LGBTQ individuals, particularly, as someone mentioned, the most vulnerable, and that would be transgender and Black transgender women specifically, and the youth. And so, we're very fortunate. Like I said, I joined NCLR during the Trump days because I thought that, we needed people on the front lines doing the work, which I think is still very important. But the whiplash for how fast the White House has changed has been, incredible. Speaking of the Bostock ruling, just on the first day in office, President Biden implemented the Bostock ruling into non-discrimination protections across the entire federal agency, which was a massive change in federal policy. And just a week and a half, 2 weeks later, he used kind of the same analysis and got rid of the trans military ban, which was a big thing that NCLR had been fighting on for several years. But I think what's happened now, and what's very unfortunate, and especially for us communicators, is that we're seeing a rapid shift from having a positive federal administration to having lots of mini battles around the country in states that are passing these bills. And I think it's been alluded to, but we've had dozens of bills that have been targeted at LGBTQ individuals, but specifically trans youth. And we're seeing them break down into the trans youth sports bills, but even more dangerously are the bills that would ban healthcare for transgender youth, medically necessary healthcare. So I think one of the biggest things that we're fighting now on the communications front is we have many LGBTQ people who live in states where they have these protections, but we have to keep the focus within the movement to make sure that they know that these bills are being passed all around the country to keep the fight going. And I think from a communication standpoint, that's been one of the hardest things, because how do you get people in a California or New York to think about the transgender youth in Arkansas that might be losing their healthcare? And going back to what Liz said, telling their stories is incredibly important. And we've seen how important and how successful that is. There was a anti-trans bill that actually failed in Utah, of all places, because their governor met with transgender youth and understood the exact ramifications these bills would have. So I think for us as communicators, we have to find a way to get through all the noise and traffic and really the message fatigue, and tell these stories so that the voices are heard and that people know what they're fighting for still.
Thanks. Christopher, Justin, anything you wanted to add?
I think what everyone said here is right on the money, right? It's about getting those stories out and making sure that you take advantage of the opportunities you have, right? So something I often talk about is I personally understand that I sit at the peak of privilege, right? I'm a cisgendered, white, gay man. I realize the privilege I have within all community, let alone my own community, and working to help other people just see that privilege in front of their own face and then be able to work across those who are facing challenges because of intersectionality. And I think that's often something that people just assume that the LGBTQ community works in unison, and that's not the case. And you need those people to be able to support and make those strides to also support people like the NCLR, right? They're in the courts making those incredible fights and doing that for us, but that's only part of it. Where's the awareness? Where's everyone lending every piece of power and privilege that they have to support everybody else? And I think that's also very, very important, because you can't do everything in the courts. You need to tell those stories. You need to have those. It's exhausting that we have to sit with every person who has a problem with us to show them what, how they can relate and how they can better understand it. It's unfortunate, but it's important. And every single bit of that requires everyone pitching in, including people like myself who didn't really encounter those kind of challenges, to be able to see that just because I didn't doesn't mean that everyone else doesn't, and being able to get in there and do the work as well.
Thanks. I mean, I just from my perspective as well, as we always say, we have a patchwork of legal protections across the country, right? There are so many states where we're not protected, and the ones where we are, people don't necessarily understand that there are over 25 states where folks don't have protections around their employment, around public accommodations, housing, and the idea of intersectionality, what Stephen brought up, what others have brought up, we have a campaign at the task force called All of Me, All of the Time. And it's because we all bring so many different things to the table. I always say to journalists, like, our community is a microcosm of the culture, because what brings us together has nothing to do with our age, our race, our ethnicity, our class, where we grew up, our geography. And so, I can't be a lesbian on Monday and a mom on Tuesday and a Italian on Wednesday and a Democrat on Thursday. Like, I'm all of those things all of the time. And so a deeper understanding of that in the media, I think, is coming. But, the folks that are on this panel and so many others are doing that work to help folks understand that, because we've made, as Stephen and others know, so much progress in representations and the diversity of those representations, especially in the not so distant future, I would say in the last 5 or 6 years even. But the political world has not necessarily caught up. And so we've got this paradox where we have a culture where we have so much acceptance. The numbers are 70% higher in terms of supporting the Equality Act, and supporting other kinds of legislation to protect our community. And yet we are seeing laws passed by politicians who don't get that. And we're fighting to get laws passed. And the folks who vote for these politicians need to be the ones that speak up, and that's part of our work as well. I want to jump to something else that I think, for a lot of us, I know we all told our stories, and what's interesting is I always hear the term accidental activist, and now I'm going to have to say accidental publicist. A lot of us come to this from different places, and I also know that I hear this all the time. I hear from journalists and other folks too who want to break into public relations and communication. So whether it's a student or whether it's a journalist, the folks who want to make the switch, or, as I joke, come to the dark side, what advice would you give to those folks? Because we're all hearing from them all the time, the folks that want to come into our world and do the kind of work we do.
I'll start. I talk to folks a lot about this. I think for students, understanding current events and following what's going on in the world around you, being inquisitive, I guess that sounds like common sense, and perhaps it is, but I think understanding how to write, how to get experience any way you can, when I was doing hiring, when I was actually working at Widmeyer, which is now owned by Finn Partners, so shout out to Finn Partners. I remember looking for not just what was on the resume in terms of a fancy school or great grades or whatever, but what experience those the different candidates had and what they brought to the table. I think also on the journalist side, there's sometimes, I mean, you joke dark side, and I think people say that sometimes. I think sometimes among PR people, there can be almost a disincentive to want to hire journalists. They see that as a bad thing. I have never understood that. I love hiring journalists. I think having journalists in PR is a hugely wonderful thing, and not just because Steven's on the panel and he's a great example of it, but those are the folks that are on the other side of the same conversation, doing the other side of that work, and having them sort of come to the opposite side of the conversation and really engage and teach us as well as us teaching them is a fabulous thing. So I guess what I'd say to journalists is don't be afraid and talk to us, and let's figure out how to get you guys in this career as they're thinking about extending what they're doing and leaving journalism.
Well, and to add on to what Ben is sharing, I think that there's something to be really said and reminded to folks that words and images matter. There is more power in moving hearts and minds and changing people's opinions at the ballot box and changing people's opinions with their next door neighbor, with their coworkers, when they are opened up to the ideas of words and images that have names and people attached to them. Much harder to demonize and villainize a person who has a name, who has a parent, who has a friend who's sitting next door to you, than it is an idea. So, from a public relations perspective, it is a wonderful career to take part in because you have the opportunity to do those things. So from a practical perspective, for folks who are looking at breaking into the industry, I would suggest an internship at an agency, large or small. That is a great way to do a couple of things. One, learn to see if it is a good fit for you, for your personality, for your life and your lifestyle. And two, to be able to demonstrate your capacity to folks who are hiring and figuring out what part of that process makes sense to you from a professional capacity. There is no shortage of jobs that are coming up in the public relations industry. I think all of our agencies across the country are seeing a huge shift post-COVID about people leaving their current agencies, looking for a new place to be, leaving their in-house jobs, wanting to be in an agency, people at agencies going in-house. There's a huge migration right now. And what that migration is offering up to the workforce and to the job force is an opportunity to really go and ask for a spot that you would like to be seated at a table around. So I think this is a great time and a great place to take what it is that your passion and purpose sort of lean into as it relates to changing hearts and minds with words and images.
I'll piggyback on that. I agree on the internships, and I think, paid internships are really, I'll just say, are really important because I recognize, we have to recognize that not everybody can afford to support themselves and do an internship. And the beauty of doing an internship, for example, I know we have interns almost every year at PFLAG. It's been a little slower this last year at PFLAG National just because of COVID, but and we just started our paid internship program. So for a long time we had unpaid interns. So I don't want to hide that fact. It's new, but we're doing it now. But our interns they're treated like staff, right? Because we're a small team. So they are in every meeting. They have a voice. And one of the big things, for example, they do every year is review and rewrite our glossary because youth lead on language. So they sit and they look at our glossary and they take it apart word by word by word and pull it apart. And then as a staff, we go through it and review their changes. And then that becomes the next iteration of our language. So that's a huge piece. The other thing I'll say is, as someone who didn't come through the typical route of college, internships, communications, is don't discount any background you may already have. I use my theater. I mean, I was trained by Paul Sills, who was one of the founders of Second City, and Mike Nichols, who was a film director, right? What would being trained as an actor have anything to do with PR? I mean, I literally put my acting and improv skills into practice every single day in this job, because acting is listening and reacting. And that is like PR. You're listening to people's stories, you're responding to them, you're figuring out how to communicate them to the right, like gearing the message to the listener. And it might be taking one person's story, but you have 7 different audiences that have to hear it. So how do you take one story and make sure that 7 different groups of people can receive it in a way that's right for them? I think that's super important. And then finally, I just want to say, bringing our whole selves to work is so important, but when you are working in an industry that is so personal to your identity, it is hard. And I want to say that I am a straight, cisgender, white, American-born human of non-childbearing age. So what I bring to work is literally just privilege 24/7. And so I am really mindful of my colleagues, because many of them, most of them, come to work and do all this work that is highly personal, and then they leave and they go home and they are being hit by everything that, I mean, the last 4 years, what a nightmare, right? So if you're coming in as someone who is afforded a privilege across any identity, be mindful of that with your colleagues, make space for that, and pick up things where you can to make that space.
Chris, I know you have something you want to hop in here with.
Yeah, I just want to say, I can't speak to the PR element of this because like I said, I haven't ever worked for a firm, but for the communications side, I think what really helped me break into it was my past experience. And I know everybody's mentioned this already, but the internships are very important. It was one thing to study PR and to know how PR theoretically works, but it was the internships that I did specifically for politicians, which taught me how to do, press releases, rapid response, talking to the press, media relations, all of that stuff. And so, what everybody has said is correct. They need to be paid internships in 2021. There's no reason that people should be doing unpaid internships. NCLR has a fully paid internship program now too. And the ones that I've had have been amazing. We've recently had a public education intern who learned so much of the real world element of the nonprofit communication world through that internship over the 8 weeks they were with us. So I think that's important. But I think another really important thing to do, especially if you want to get into this work, and I'm probably going to speak for the other nonprofit comms people here, but get yourself mentors. Like, we're all happy to help teach you, lead you, give you all the skills you need, even if you don't have time for an internship. We always have time for a virtual coffee or anything to talk you into it. But like I said, I think we need LGBTQ people, specifically LGBTQ people of color, and trans individuals to get into the communications world, because those are the voices that really need to be spotlighted and brought to the forefront.
Yeah, I want to echo what Chris says. We only have a few more minutes, and I know we have some questions in the Q&A. We'll have the Q&A period and get to them because they're both really important. The one thing I would say is, as someone who was mentored, I try and pay it forward and be a mentor. And we're very intentional around bringing more diverse voices into our world. But the advice that I always give, whether it's someone who wants to get into the PR world or who is just starting out, is understand that this is the kind of job where it doesn't feel like a job, it's more like a vocation. I say it all the time, and that it requires a tremendous amount of education. It's not, for those of us, especially in the nonprofit world, but really everywhere, it's not like a product, we're people. and our job is to help make our community less abstract to the rest of the world. And as my wife jokes, you can take the girl out of GLAAD, but you can't take the GLAAD out of the girl. It's about really being activists and being engaged, and and helping people tell their own stories. So let's see, Justin, did you have any last words you wanted to hop in here before we?
Yeah, just to say that, I've worked in PR my entire career and I've never written a single press release. So also to people who want to get involved in PR, every PR agency also has creative, social, digital, all these sort of things, because that's part of PR too, right? Thinking holistically about, yeah, you got the story, but how is that story then being shared, amplified, engaged with? What are the stories you're pitching? Are you pulling that information from social media listening or digital or based on trends and competitive analyses of things? So there is tons of work in PR agencies that does not involve anything from media monitoring, press releasing, and pitching. There's still a lot of work to be done in these agencies as well. And I'm actually hiring right now for a position like that. So keep that in mind too.
Kathy, can I add one thought before we go?
Go ahead.
Just to build on what we were just talking about in terms of mentorship, I think it's really important, going back to Stephanie's point about sort of being, as someone just said, at the pinnacle. We have to lift other folks up, and we have to look for those other LGBTQ folks that we can help get jobs in the industry and engage in the industry. There is still a pink ceiling. Yes, I'm a white gay man. Yes, I've had a lot of privilege. I can tell you, I worked in 5 PR firms. I have wonderful stories. It was a great experience. I loved it. There is a pink ceiling in this industry still today in 2021. One of the ways that we're going to break through it is we're going to demonstrate that we understand this work and we know how to do it. We're also going to lift each other up, and we're going to do that thinking intentionally about what that looks like, and people who don't look like us, and people who don't have our experience, and people who don't have our opportunities. So it's up to all of us to do that, and it's up to all of us to go back to that storytelling that I think we heard from Stephanie as well, and really, pay it forward and keep doing the work.
Thanks, Ben. I could not think of a better note to end on, except to say that you're all PR people. Put your Twitter handles and your email addresses in the chat, especially if you're hiring. And I think all of us are hiring right now. And let folks know, and then you're going to come back for the Q&A. But I want to thank you all so much for taking the time during the busiest month of the year to talk to us about your experience and give us some advice. So I'm going to toss it back to Jenny now, and she's going to lead us into our next part of the program.
Thank you so much, Kathy. Thank you so much, panel 1, for those wonderful insights. We're so happy to have you all here, and we'd like to thank everyone again for joining us this evening. So for the first time, we're going to have an entertainment break during one of these shows. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, it is a surprise halftime program, courtesy of the Gay Men's Chorus of Orange County, or Men Alive, and as well as Dr. Bailing Shaw. So without further ado, I will play their video.
Climb every mountain, search high and low, follow every byway, every path you know. When you walk through a storm, hold your head up high, and don't be afraid of the dark.
and we're back. Thank you so much. When I was in my glad days, back in the Stone Age, and I did media trainings, no matter where I went, no matter how big a small town I was in, there was always a chorus and a P-Flag chapter. So I appreciate the entertainment interlude there. Thank you so much. We are going to move this conversation into the world of journalism, which I am super excited about. If we could have our journalism folks come on camera. I see some of them. All right. I'm going to go ahead and have each of them just very briefly introduce themselves and let us know what outlet they work with. Tristan, why don't I start with you?
Hi, everyone. I'm Tristan McAllister. First, thank you, Kathy, for doing this and presenting this. And thank you to all the other panelists and especially the keynote. That was incredible to hear. So thank you for sharing your story. I'm Tristan McAllister. I'm a journalist. I also do some work in advertising because it's all storytelling. In some places you make more money than others, but currently I have my own podcast. It's called Why Here on all the platforms, and I have it with my co-host. And yeah, we focus very specifically on LGBTQ plus and ally stories, frankly, anyone who's sort of created in the margins. And every episode is about specifically one person and how what they do relates to what's going on in the world today and where they came from. We've had many guests across the spectrum, many of which are of note and names you'd recognize. If you're interested, please look it up. I'm very happy to be here today, and thanks again for having me.
Thanks, Tristan. Travell, I'm so glad to have you with us. Can you tell us, you write for so many publications. Tell us a little bit about your work, and then let us know what are you working on now?
Sure. I am a freelance entertainment journalist. Happy to be here as well. I am also editor at large for Extra Magazine, which is a Toronto-based digital LGBTQ outlet. I too have my own podcast, as I feel like everyone does these days, called Fanti, F-A-N-T-I, available wherever slay-worthy audio can be found. And let's see, what am I working on now? I think I am just always committed to trying to tell more stories about Black and brown, queer, and trans folks. And doing it in queer media, but also doing it in mainstream, quote unquote, media as well.
I just did that thing. I know. I saw, I was covered by the chat. I apologize. Alex, tell us a little bit about who you write for. It's one of the most trafficked LGBTQ media sites around, right?
Yes, I'm the managing editor at LGBTQ Nation, which is owned by Q Digital, that also owns Queerty, Gay Cities, and Them. Before that, I was working at the Bolerico Project, which is where I met you, Kathy, 14 years ago, a long time ago, back when Bush was president. That is how, yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Dawn Ennis. Dawn, one of the hardest working journalists in the queer and mainstream media. Tell us a little bit about who you're working for and writing for now, and what you've been writing about.
Well, the most important part of my story is that I came out to Kathy Renna 11 years ago. She was the first person I came out to in person. I was working at WABC, and she had brought in a wonderful guest, and we were riding the elevator down to the lobby. And I don't know why, you just won me over. And I said, you know, I'm transgender. And she gave me a big hug. What else do you need to know? I came out as a transgender woman 8 years ago this summer. I was the first out transgender journalist in TV network news in the US. I was at ABC. Since then, I've transitioned into online journalism. I was the news editor at The Advocate. I worked with Alex at LGBTQ Nation as assistant managing editor, and I have recently stepped down from outsports.com, the LGBTQ sports site, where I was the managing editor for the last 2.5 years. Right now, I'm a university professor. I am also a college student. I am going for my master's, and I am a contributor to Forbes.com as well as the Daily Beast and the sports editor at the Los Angeles Blade. Oh, I almost forgot.
Nope.
I'm the mom of the 2 kids who were chewing down on dinner I just prepared while the public relations folks were talking. I was listening, but I was cooking, and my youngest is at camp. So most important job I have is being mom.
I could not agree more. Last and certainly not least, as someone who is for me an inspiration, an icon, a pioneer in queer media and beyond, part of a really, I'll just say it, journalistic dynasty in Chicago. Tracy, I am so happy to just see your face, but we are absolutely thrilled to have you with us tonight. So can you introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your work, but not all of it, because we only have 30
Sure. Thanks for having me, Kathy, and it's great to be on the panel. I started work at Gay Life newspaper in 1984. So this is my 37th year in LGBT media, and pretty much every single year it has been different from the prior year. So there's certainly been a lot of change, progress, regression, everything mixed in. I co-founded Windy City Times in 1985. Last year it moved to an online only format, although I'm co-publisher of the Chicago Reader now, and we are doing a print insert of Windy City Times 4 times a year. I'm not doing as much active LGBT journalism these days because my job, I feel like right now, is to save the next generation of jobs for LGBTQ journalists. So we have some fantastic younger journalists at the Reader and Windy City Times, and a lot of cross-pollination. I'm going to put in the chat link the most recent Pride issue. It was a joint project of the Chicago Reader and Windy City Times, so it kind of gives some examples of the great investigative journalism in the LGBTQ space that both entities are doing. Thank you for having me today.
Absolutely. So I want to jump right into this. So, you all are the ones that are telling the stories. We're the ones that are trying to convince you to tell the stories, but talk about areas where you want to and need to see more and better coverage of LGBTQ issues. What can we do better to work with you? And I'll open it up to anyone.
I guess I'll take a stab at it. I can't remember a time in which adults were beating up on children and the politicians were behind it. This is a very fraught time in America. And one of the things that one of my colleagues at Outsports and we hosted a podcast called the Trans Sporter Room, mix a little sports and sci-fi. We kept bringing home the point, these are kids. These are kids. These are children. And they're being treated as if they're, opponents, and they are combatants. And they're someone's children. And very often, the other thing that I wanted to just underscore is that under all of this, haven't we learned from last summer, there is a racist aspect to the attack on transgender children, because a lot of these trans athletes are also Black. And I think that it's been lost in the conversation. And I think what cisgender and straight journalists need to do is to stop worrying about both sidesism and other isms and focus on the stories of these courageously brave parents and their children who just want to be.
Thank you, Dawn. I appreciate that. I mean, I've been working with trans kids and families for well over a decade, and we're really just starting to see great coverage and stories. So I appreciate that. Who wants to jump in?
Travell, I saw you wanted to go. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Tristan.
Yeah, just one of the things that comes to mind too, and I worked on a really big piece of work. I moonlight as a podcaster. I also do a lot of branded content, more specifically for a major publication in New York. I'm not going to say their name because I'm not representing them here, but I was working on a very large project where we were trying to tell a number of stories about athletes across the spectrum, especially non-binary and trans. And one of the things that really struck me was how unobvious it was to so many of us in the beginning that we actually needed to perhaps find trans journalists and journalists that understood those stories better to come. And then when we went and did that, the stories were so much better and they were so much clearer. And I think one of the hard things as a journalist is you are taught, especially in school, in the doctrine and the dogma from journalism, you think, well, it's best when you're an outsider to cover a story because, you know, you're impartial. And I think there's a tension in that when it comes to storytelling as we tell it as journalists, but also as we think about it from the PR and the communication side too, is it's so important that as we learn to tell these stories and as these stories get out there, that we really work to find not just gay journalists, but journalists who are beyond that, journalists who understand the trans narrative, who understand the non-binary narrative, because that's only going to help us tell these stories better. And it just became so much clearer when we were trying to tell these stories, finding these folks. It was easier to go in and get the story. It was easier to fact check the story. I mean, all those things that are so important in terms of telling a story properly lined up for us when we actually cast properly in trying to tell it.
I just offer a resource to Tristan's point. The Trans Journalists Association is a great, relatively new organization and collective of trans journalists. And when I say journalists, it runs the gamut of video producers, audio engineers, etc. in that group. So if you are looking to hire trans and non-binary folks, you can check them out. I'll answer the latter part of your question, Kathy, in terms of like what I feel PR folks could do to support me and my work. And I think, you know, the main thing that's coming to mind is the types of pitches that I get when it's surrounding and related to LGBT people, LGBT stories and narratives. You know, I sometimes feel like I get pitched like I'm straight. What I mean is, you know, the most interesting thing about the pitch is that they're trans or that they're gay or whatever. And it's like, that doesn't make me come alive, you know? And so I would love, you know, more intentionality on behalf of, you know, some of the publicists who pitch me. Because, you know, while yes, I'm interested in uplifting queer and trans people, you know, I just feel like you got to come a little harder, you know, in terms of the structure of the pitch and what the actual, you know, story is.
No, thanks. I appreciate that. I remember when, yes, being queer was interesting enough to be the peg for a story, and it's not anymore. I've had the chance to work with an organization called Gender Cool, which is an amazing organization of trans and non-binary youth who are not just surviving, but thriving and are telling their stories. And what they always say is being trans is like the third or fourth most interesting thing about them. And that's the kind of world they want to create for all trans, non-binary, and queer kids. But I really deeply appreciate that. Did anybody else want to jump in on that, or we want to hop to the next question?
I have a little more kind of a little bit jaded, cynical answer that's historically been jaded, and that is, you know, there's this contention between PR, marketing, and advertising as it relates to the LGBTQ community. I think when it comes to the entertainment side and the kind of the things that are very news adjacent, things that really are truly, you know, news adjacent, feature adjacent, that's different than when we're talking about corporations that are targeting the LGBTQ community. And I often feel like the value of the LGBT community is often devalued in the way that major corporations target our community through very insignificant, tiny percentages of their budget, and do that through PR versus traditional marketing. We're an aberration in the scheme of things. I'll call out Apple as a perfect example of a company that has taken advantage of both the African-American and queer communities and the African-American queer communities that have been on the front line of being their product early adopters and been exploited and not supported in any way. And we are losing LGBTQ media as we have been for the last 20 years, and losing LGBTQ journalists in mainstream media, right? The beats are going away. And if we want that kind of storytelling that Tristan talks about, that are also through LGBTQ owned outlets and LGBTQs at mainstream outlets, we have to figure out a way to make sure those corporations are also accountable for their budgets and how they're treating their consumers better. So it's a little bit of contention I've seen over the last 30 years. I've been trying to advocate for this.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. I think it's a real challenge. I mean, I'd love to hear more from the panelists and the folks who are working in queer media, because especially in the past year with COVID, but even for years prior, even the national and other queer organizations, their first thought is always, be in the mainstream, and the community media often gets lost, and that's where our stories are often told best and first. I mean, things have gotten so much better. Have we created the kind of atmosphere where people don't feel they need LGBT media as much? The answer for me to that is always no. And I always try and focus on putting our dollars in advertising. We did a Queer the Census campaign last year with the task force, and a big part of that was reaching out to the community. We couldn't do events because of COVID, so we advertised in queer media so we could directly reach the community, and also frankly support queer media at a time when really tough. So I'd love to hear more from others working in queer media about that.
Well, I'll just add, before starting at Extra, I worked, I was the director of entertainment and culture or something like that at Out Magazine, and was able to see up close, particularly coming from the Los Angeles Times to Out Magazine, the difference in conversations when you're talking to potential advertisers, the hurdles and the hoops that queer media has to jump through in order to get, a slither of the Pride budget alone, not even regular money. I'm talking about Pride money, honey, and it is one of the reasons why I think queer media struggles. And one of the things that we often hear is that, to your point, Kathy, that, you don't necessarily have to go to queer media anymore to get to queer audiences, because one, queer people consume all of these types of stuff, but also you have more and more mainstream outlets creating various verticals specifically to target, news that might be of interest to queer and trans folks. But I think that is why, we in queer media have to continue doing the types of storytelling that we do. I am firm that the types of storytelling we do, it's just going to hit differently and be received differently by the community. Even if, there is a queer person doing that work at a mainstream outlet. I say that as somebody who was that person for 4 years. And so I think that is part of the conversation as well. It's kind of taking a more 360 view at this conversation around the importance of queer media, and then also realizing that on the consumer side of things, you have to subscribe, you have to click on the queer media stories. You should go to Out Sports for your queer trans sports news, right? Not necessarily to the New York Times or ESPN or wherever, right? And how everybody has a role to play in sustaining queer media.
Let me pick up on that. Thank you for the plug. Even though I'm not with them anymore, there's still a place in my heart for Out Sports. We would often hear from athletes who are ready to come out, and they'd be like, yeah, I'm going to talk to ESPN. Yeah, I'm going to talk to Sports Illustrated. And they'd couch it as, well, they have a bigger platform. They have a bigger audience. Well, how do they get that big audience? By not focusing on our community. And same with, I'm about to interview a big out TV person, all right? And the publicist is really excited about it. But when I told them it was going to appear in Connecticut Voice magazine, an LGBT magazine for folks in Connecticut, they were like, yeah, could you get it in the New York Times? And the same thing happens. I know I write for the Daily Beast and Forbes, and they're mainstream publications. But unless I am, showing them that we cover the LGBT community as well as mainstream news, most people just want to go to the cisgender straight media. And I want those pitches that have been flooding my inbox. I'm sure Alex is too, and Travell and everybody else, Tristan, during Pride Month. I want them 11 months out of the year. I just don't want them 1 month. It's like, guys, we want to cover intersectionality and LGBTQ 12 months a year.
Thanks. I appreciate that, Dawn. We have a little bit of time. We have some time left. I want to ask, I guess, a little bit more on the personal side. You know, as folks who are part of the community that are working in community media or covering our issues, how do you experience that as part of the community yourself? I know we talk a lot about you know, objectivity and balance and all of those things in journalism, but the truth is we bring ourselves, you know, to work every day, and that's got to have some kind of impact on how we do our work. And for journalists, I find it really interesting to hear from them, you know, what that experience is like for them. I'm going to start with Tristan, because I know you have a super interesting story about your experience doing the podcast most recently, and what that's been like for you and your podcast partner.
Yeah, of course. So yeah, I have a podcast with my best friend Benton, and it happened in the middle of COVID, or it started with COVID starting. We happened to live together, and we were sitting trying to figure out what the heck we were going to do with our lives, because everything was shutting down. He's a Broadway casting director. I have a background in journalism. And we just thought, why don't we tell stories about people who came to New York and now they're wondering why the hell they're here, because we are all wondering that, because we're stuck inside of our homes and it's kind of hell when New York isn't New York, right? So we're like, let's have a podcast. Let's call it Why Here. Do the first episode with an ER doctor, a lovely guy who's queer, who was working in the Bronx, in the heart of it. And then we started asking him questions about bringing himself as a queer person to work every day, and what that has taught him about being an emergency physician. And he gave us a really incredible answer about us being able to, as queer folks, we share stories with each other, we create context with each other, and that's how we create community with each other. And that actually enables him to go and be a better doctor every day, because he knows how to talk to people. He knows how to practice empathy. And that really was like an amazing jumping off point for us. And that was something we hadn't really thought about before. And that was the second or third week of May 2020. And the week later, George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis. What happened from there was a number of really illuminating interviews weekly, a number of which with Black folks in the queer community, LGBTQ, non-binary, every part of our community. And we started to learn through our conversations, because we were queer folks talking to other queer folks in these otherwise marginalized communities, that we had a way of connecting with these people that oftentimes cis white people who weren't part of the LGBTQ community could connect with these people. So all of a sudden we were having these conversations about identity and race and LGBTQ issues and so many other things. And we realized that like we actually had a platform in something that was way beyond what we had initially considered, in the context of the cultural moment and the race reckoning that was going on in the US and COVID and all of these other things. So I think we started to learn, I think to answer your question, Kathy, is like what we were bringing to work every day, or at least to this hobby, this thing that we were just we thought was fun at first, was this like honesty and this compassion in these conversations that otherwise weren't being had in the media. And that ended up being really powerful. And it also sort of started to be self-fulfilling. And then other folks in all of these communities started to see, and they were willing to say yes. So, you know, now we've had some A-list celebrities across the spectrum who've been drawn to the show, who are really interested because they see that this is a chance to have like an hour-long an honest conversation where it's not shrunken down into sound bites, which so many other media outlets tend to want to do. So it's been really, really interesting.
Great, thanks, Tristan. I appreciate you sharing that. Alex, you work on, you know, you have different platforms, different audiences. Talk a little bit about what that's like.
So LGBTQ Nation gets a lot of traffic, and we publish a lot of stories every day. We work with a lot of different freelancers, and keeping up with the news when it can be so negative all the time means that we are asking people, and a lot of different people to write about their own experiences in a way that can be triggering for them. So one thing that we always do when we assign a story is we make it clear to the person who's writing it that they can always turn it down if it's something too personal. We're not here to ruin anyone's day. We're not here to ruin anyone's week, or however long it'll take to write it. And on the other side of that, one thing we've been doing this past year at LGBTQ Nation is a weekly good news newsletter, because we do a daily newsletter that aggregates our stories of the day and brings in a lot of traffic. And now we're doing a good news one just with positive stories, just like grandmothers baking rainbow cakes, or trans 10-year-olds fighting a law in their state and succeeding, or like stories like that that can bring people up instead of bringing them down. And this is something I was thinking about with your earlier question about what is not being covered well in the media, or what we could do to increase and make better our coverage of LGBTQ issues. And one thing that's become very clear this past year is that I don't want to use the D word, but let's say the decrease, another D word, in local media outlets actually really it ripples out, and it affects how stories get covered in all sorts of different outlets. The biggest story of this past year, as we've heard multiple people on this panel and on the previous panel, and Stephanie in her keynote address talk about, are the various trans laws, the dozens and dozens of states that are attacking transgender youth this year. That's the biggest story of the year. It's also one of the hardest stories for us to write about, because it's something that's happening locally. It's happening in dozens of states. It's occurring in different state houses. We don't necessarily know people who are working in every state legislature, et cetera. And getting more information about what's going on has been difficult, mainly just because local news media has shrunk. Their budgets are smaller. They're not necessarily putting this as a priority in their state. Like, we're talking about the local newspaper in Montana or in South Dakota or something like that. And for those of us outside of the state trying to get information about that, it's been much more difficult. So I'm thinking about the stories that have really worked for us this year, that have really spoken to people, that have gotten attention on social media, and of course have gotten clicks, because that's what we do. I can think of, just off the top of my head, about half a dozen stories that are local people fighting against these trans laws and in some way succeeding, or in some way making a statement, and sometimes succeeding as well. And those are the kinds of stories that I think people want to see. There's a hunger for that kind of story this year, and there's also just not enough of them. We're not coming across them enough to satisfy that hunger.
You know, I'm thinking of, and I don't remember your question, Kathy, but I have an answer anyway. Um, I'm just thinking about, I can't remember who made the comment earlier about the both sides approach that Dawn, that, you know, a lot of the mainstream outlets in particular are employing. And, you know, something that I often say is that this idea of objectivity, you know, will be the demise of our industry. I, you know, often say that objectivity is a machination of white supremacy, and it is a scam. And that it is something that is often, you know, foisted upon those of us who live at various intersections, and because, you know, the people in power, right, are already determining what is and what is not objective. And I think what's important as we, you know, see this ongoing coverage of the anti-trans legislation, the Equality Act, et cetera, is that, you know, newsrooms across this land have to seriously grapple with, engage in conversations internally about what side of history they want to be on. Right. And I think we saw last year a number of newsrooms, from the LA Times to the New York Times to the Washington Post, you know, have conversations about race, and have conversations about not only how they're treating their Black and Brown employees, but how they're covering Black and Brown communities. We're now capitalizing the being Black and all of this other stuff. But what we haven't yet had the conversation is how those same decisions that you can now see, that you once saw as political decisions that you stayed away from, that you now see the humanity of Black folks. So now you accept it as fact, we need to continue extending that to trans people and to other LGBTQ folks in terms of what our coverage looks like. Because we shouldn't be doing a both sides thing when it comes to trans humanity. You either believe that trans people should, be able to move through the world in the ways that we want to, or you don't. And there is no both sides. And so I'm interested in seeing more newsrooms grapple with that and begin to change and shift their coverage as it relates to that as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate that so much. Tracy.
We are so far removed from that question. Can I hear it again?
Well, at first I asked how you bring yourself to, this work, particularly in queer media. And when Travell said the word history, I immediately thought of you, because you have been not just part of so much of the history of the community in terms of covering it, but you've also worked with so many individuals who are part of our history, which is of course not really taught in schools. And I think of Barbara Giddings. When Kay passed recently, you were, one of the first people I thought of. So can you talk a little bit about that,
in 1984, I think there were like 5 openly gay journalists in mainstream media in this country, including Randy Schultz. And I always say 5 just because I'm assuming there were more than just Randy, but that's the only one I know. And so I couldn't be openly gay and work at the Chicago Tribune. There were gay people at the Tribune. My stepfather worked there, so I knew they were there and they were hiding a portion of their lives. So this whole notion is just forever there. In the 1990s, someone lost their job at the Christian Science Monitor because they came out. People couldn't, if they were openly gay photographer in San Francisco, they couldn't cover a gay event as a photographer. I mean, this notion of some kind of objective reality is ridiculous. And the more we fight against that, the more we will get to the truth. It's like, it's what's kept us from the truth. They used to cover hangings in the 1900s in one way in certain papers, and that's why Ida B. Wells did her own thing so that she could be quote unquote objective right into her own community. So this is an ongoing fight. I do see the gender lens of all of this as being really complex, much more difficult than when NLGJA was started to confront having openly gay and lesbian, really, and maybe bisexual in the newsrooms. This transgender issue is going to be one of the most difficult for newsrooms to get, since there are over 50 or probably 500 variations of this, and the nuance of it even our own community doesn't get. So to put the mainstream education on this is going to be a real high hurdle.
Thanks, I appreciate that. So we've only got 2 minutes left. So in the quickest way you can, I want each of you to give the folks out here, most of whom I'm assuming work in PR and comms, a tip on how they can make their work better and your lives easier. Dawn, I'll let you go first.
Hire trans, hire non-binary, hire bisexuals, write about and promote and pitch about bisexuals and about non-binary individuals. And if you don't get non-binary, then ask me, ask someone, ask a lot of people, ask. The only stupid question I tell my students is the one you don't ask.
Awesome. Travell?
I think for me, one of the things I've been having conversations with a lot of publicists about is just how my approach to my job has changed in the last year. And so if you want my response to your pitch or whatever, it needs to come in advance. Don't hit me up 48 hours before your event or situation. You're not getting a response, honey. I'm hitting delete. So I think everyone just needs to restructure how we look at this job, because now so many of us as journalists, aren't necessarily, committing our full 24/7 lives to the work. We're taking time to do some self-care. So it requires a shift in approach.
Awesome. Thank you. Alex?
Something that really changed this past year was the pandemic. That changed a lot of things. This past March, we had a meeting at Q Digital with the people who work at the various websites that Q Digital owns. We had amazing plans to hire more people, do more feature content. I can make the whole list. About 2 weeks later, all those plans got thrown into the garbage because we lost so much revenue from advertising, because most of our advertising comes from prides, it comes from events, and it comes from travel. So we had to, instead of expanding our staff, we had to reduce. We had to put freelancers on hold. We had to put someone to part-time, and we all had to take pay cuts. And all during this time, the workload stayed the same. We still get hundreds of pitches. We get so many pitches all the time in our email address. I can't really keep up. So I'll just repeat what Travell said. Send early, and I'll add send often, because just because I don't respond, that's usually because I'm busy and then I forget, and then it goes off the first page of my email in like maybe 2 or 3 hours. And I've done this to you, Kathy, so many times. I
True that.
apologize.
True that. Oh, I take nothing personally, not to worry. And I'll just keep bugging you. Tristan.
Mine's pretty simple. Just, will you please read or listen to whatever you're pitching? Because like, well, I get pitched things all the time and it's like, you don't know what we do. Like, just go read the description of the show, or just go read the description of the publication, or like go to the Twitter account or go to the Instagram and just get a feel for what their voice is. I swear to God, it will help.
Or dear Bob. Dear Bob. I'm like, my name isn't Bob.
Just seriously, just know who you're pitching. Like,
Oh boy. Yeah, I've seen some crazy ones. Yeah.
Just
they always make the rounds. The really, really crazy ones.
I don't expect a personalized email. Just know who you're pitching. That's the only request.
All righty. This is all good stuff. Tracy.
I would say be part of the solution. It's not going to take much to save LGBTQ media, but if we do nothing, it's gone. We're almost at a tipping point, because the fewer there are, the less likely ad firms and others will design things for us and create things for us. And I think the public relations community could do a lot in terms of helping publicize that problem. So help us.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. Well, I want to thank all of you for taking the time and sharing your experiences and your wisdom with us and help us do our jobs better. We are going to go to, we're so on time. This is amazing. We're going to go to questions, and we've got 2 in the chat. If others have questions, please put them in the Q&A box. I'm seeing some wonderful compliments in the chat. Also, for all you journalists, put your links and your Instagram and Twitter handles in there as well. We've got a couple really good questions, and I'm just gonna kind of open it up to everybody. The first question from Jenny Morgan. Sorry, I'm having trouble reading. Getting a little old. There are those in the community who feel that the amount of in-your-face corporate sponsorship this year is overboard. As PR pros, do you take any responsibility for this supposed overdose of rainbow colors, or do you see deeper involvement a good thing, especially for the future? I could talk about that for an hour, but I'm not going to. I'm going to toss it to, okay, I see a hand. Justin, go for it.
Yeah. I was going to jump on that just based off of what we just heard Tracy say right before you made this transition. I think there's something very important. I come from a time when no corporations talked about any of this stuff, right? So I fall in an interesting place where, to me, you know, gay kid in some town, state somewhere walks into Walmart and sees some rainbows. I think that does a huge service to them. I think that's extremely supportive. I understand the complexities of corporate involvement in Pride. I understand that there's a lot of arguments against it, but they also are bringing money. And I think that's very important, especially as we're talking about queer media and we're talking about social media. That's a very important part too. So maybe there needs to be more communication with the corporate interests and getting it to be more authentic. I think that what people are often bemoaning is a lack of authenticity, or the fact that corporate support is at least only communicated during Pride Month. There are lots of corporations who have that kind of support on a year-round basis. They need to work better to promote that and communicate that, I think. But ultimately, I don't see a problem from it in regards to money is important. It's saving queer media. It's saving small media, local media. And I think it's very important. And I think that the disconnection needs to be fixed elsewhere within it.
Everything Justin just said. And if a corporation is not contributing to part of our movement in some meaningful way, then that is opportunistic. And that's where I think we need to draw the line. And as PR practitioners, people who work in marketing and PR, we won't take on clients who want to wrap themselves in a rainbow flag with a communications plan that doesn't have some sort of corporate and social responsibility component to it. And that's, I remember, working at GLAAD in the Stone Age, sometime around 12, 15, I believe. We're handing out GLAAD Media Awards like paper plates, right? The lack of corporate partners in the world was something that really felt dangerous. And there is something that feels more supportive when you go to the Fresno Mall, which is where I grew up. And I was there a few weeks ago, and I see all these windows that have flags and kids standing in front of them. And it makes me feel good because that was the mall that I was bullied in. And so it is important that we, acknowledge the importance of corporations and corporate support, but also hold them accountable to have some sort of real impact.
I do think the Anheuser-Busch thing
You said it.
in New
There
York
you go.
City is important. And also, I've been trying to advocate for HRC to keep raising the bar related to external issues. A lot of their early years have been focused on internal change, which is terrific, but it's really easy to get 100 and also get the category of external outreach. It's like buy one ad and you get that. So I really think advocating for a percentage-based system, and I would say this for any demographic, in terms of those companies that are consumer-facing and are doing external visibility, that needs to be a much more difficult category, because that equality index has been a great way to change companies. But now they do change it every 2 or 3 years. They give the corporations heads up. And I think this is a really important one. I've pushed out and advocated HRC from the inside. It's not working, but I do think that would be profoundly changing if it was for LGBT-owned media to be part of the campaigns, as well as those who do really well on LGBT coverage.
Hey,
Totally.
Tracy, I wanted to tag onto that. Excuse me, Ben, because when I was writing the book, I've been involved with the Corporate Equality Index from like the beginnings. But when I was writing the book, I went back and actually went through all of them, because you can get them all online, all the Corporate Equality Index reports, right? And I will say for sure, as a card-carrying member of the trans community, your point about how the Corporate Equality Index has raised the bar for the trans community is very important. Clearly with, health benefits and health benefits for our families, and gender affirming surgeries being at the top. But what hit me about the whole thing with Anheuser-Busch was they got to do the same thing now on the external advocacy piece. But the thing that will always get me about the Corporate Equality Index, lest we forget, is that is a self-directed survey. They send it to the company, somebody in the D&I space, it gets, and oftentimes not a senior person in HR somewhere in a cubicle gets thrown that to do. And I saw that at New York Life, where we got a rating and I'm like, wait a minute, we don't do that. Who's, how did this happen? So, there's some internal, there's some internal structural things that I think it's important that we all recognize and kind of call out in that entire process. It's great, don't get me wrong, it's really helped, but we want to make it better. And recognizing how that all works internally, I think is a real important part of that next page, next chapter.
Totally agree. And just to pile on here with what everyone else said, it is an either or. We can do both, right? We can say thank you for putting up the sign at the Fresno Mall. We can say thank you for having a flag. And we can also say that's not enough. We can also say that simply changing your logo once a month, once a year to rainbow and doing nothing else is not enough. And we're watching and we're going to hold you accountable. I think the other piece to keep in mind here is just building on what Stephanie was saying. The CEI is a whole other conversation. We could do 2 hours on that. That served a purpose. So I was at Fleischman Hillard. I was an SVP at Fleischman Hillard, part of the Omnicom empire. I was the one who worked with the Omnicom lawyers filling out the CEI for the first time Omnicom ever did it. And the Omnicom score wasn't great. They get 100 now, decades later, but Omnicom score wasn't great. But that was one of the things that moved them to start having those conversations and to start doing that work. Obviously, the world has moved on and things have changed. We need to sort of keep doing the same thing and keep raising the bar and keep holding folks accountable. So say thank you, and then say, what else are you going to do? And to Stephen's point, well, how are you going to get engaged with our community? And we need to hold them to account, as you know, we're sort of doing with Anheuser, although I think we should do more. But anyway,
And
I'm
I'll
gonna.
and sorry, just as a from the advocate, you know, and nonprofit side, I think what Ben was just saying is very important. You know, we have to hold them accountable. We've seen that the form of allyship just doesn't work anymore. We have to have true allyship, especially on matters that are being overlooked, specifically these attacks on trans youth. I mean, look back in 2014 and in North Carolina, what actually got that law overturned was the fact that businesses in the NCAA were willing to put their money where their mouth were and boycott the state, which hurt them financially. And what we're not seeing this time around is organizations or corporations doing the same for these anti-trans bills in states in other parts of the country. We're not even seeing the NCAA, which said that they pulled championships from these states, stick to their word. So yeah, say thanks, but also say to the AT&Ts that are giving hundreds of thousands of dollars to anti-trans lawmakers, you know, we expect better of you, and we're not going to consider you an ally until you start standing up for those who need to be protected.
And there's also something, I know our learning and inclusion team, a lot of our corporate partnerships come with learning and inclusion training so that we're helping them write more inclusive policies. We're making sure that they're getting the training that they need. We're advocating for them to launch partnerships that are visible the other 11 months a year. You know, when we get a call on May 15th to do something in June, we said, have you considered August? Have you considered one of the other 11 months where LGBTQ plus people are still alive and trying to thrive and are, by the way, are working at your company? You know, there are policies, and then there are the lived experience of the people at those companies who may be benefiting from those policies, but workplace climate and workplace policies do not always, they don't always align. Our learning inclusion team talks about that frequently, that policy and lived experience don't always mesh. And how do we ask the questions to get more at that? And I do appreciate the partners who are willing to say, we want to do this year long, and actually we'd prefer to not launch it in June because June is what everybody does, and we want people to really know we mean this, and that's always appreciated. It means something.
Liz, thanks for that. It's so true. You know, I mean, just before we get to our last question, which I'm going to tee up from the Q&A over here, it's come out a lot, and I just want to say it one more time as we approach the end of Pride Month. You know, I thought about this and wrote about this and back at the end of March when it was the International Transgender Day of Visibility on March 31st. It's like, well, I don't go under a rock for the next 364 days, you know, so we shouldn't treat it like that. And it's the same thing for Pride Month. You know, let's not, you know, we have to be advocates for the entire community to make sure that the drum keeps getting banged, so to speak. And I think that's very important. And I didn't want to lose that. So we have a handful of other questions here, but I'm just going to pick one because we're up against time. How do you think, and this is from Shelley, how do you think the media and PR industries are doing as far as their embrace of LGBTQ employees compared to other industries? Anyone? Tracy, you're raising your hand. Thank you.
That was from before, but I would say
that was from before? Oh,
yeah,
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, I should have taken it down. But I would say that there's too much diversity in the community that is not represented. So it's even on this panel today, we could say that. So I would say go deep or go home.
All right, well, since I screwed up and asked a question that was already asked, how can individual leaders within the PR industry best serve as allies to you? And what makes an authentic ally? Anyone?
I think empathy is part and parcel of that. You know, this otherizing, which, you know, I think many of us have experienced since we were really cognizant and aware of our surroundings is something that continues to be in the workplace. Oh, how was that gay party, or how was that brunch where you guys all went to, or how was the this or the that? There's an otherizing that continues in the workplace. Certainly, not in all workplaces, but leadership can best be allies when leadership is representative of the diversity of our communities and of our country, and not in a way that's tokenized or performative. So I think the allies, leaders in our industry need to continue to diversify. I think it's pretty self-acknowledged in our industry, in the public relations industry, that this panel of people here is not reflective of actually how the leadership looks like across the country. And I know that many of the corporate sort of PR places are working very hard at that. And it's going to take years to rectify decades and generations of being marginalized and otherized. So I think, part of that, being middle-aged is I have learned a little bit of patience. And part of what I've also learned in appreciating a younger generation is throwing my patience out the window and, sort of combining those two things together to make some sort of meaningful change.
Speak up, speak out, and do the work.
Well, and I just want to add, I worked at a PR firm for a couple of years in between GLAAD and then going off on my own. And I have to say that the otherism that I experienced was more about being a woman and more about my gender expression than it was about being lesbian. And I think and this speaks to the multiple identities that we all have, and we all bring, if we bring all of ourselves to work. And it's something for our own community to work on, as well as the larger culture and, of course, the larger our industry.
I'd just like to add that, I think in terms of like what makes a good ally, I think it has to go beyond empathy. I think, what I need is I need people to get their hands dirty. I need you to give up some of that privilege you have. I need you to get uncomfortable. I need for you, I don't need to be the person in a room, forcing people to acknowledge my pronouns, right? You need to be doing that, right? You need to feel some sort of unsettling in your everyday life in order to demonstrate to me that not only you care, not only that you empathize, but that you're willing to get dirty, you're willing to give up something to also see me succeed and sustain and thrive as well. And I think, so much about what we understand to be allyship, it's about showing up to, maybe a protest with a sign and, I think about the Brooklyn Liberation March. Last year, 15,000 some odd people showed up to the Brooklyn Liberation March, in the middle of a pandemic to march for Black trans lives. They held it again this year. I happened to be there. I'll let you know, 15,000 people were not there this year, right? And so it's also about sustaining that work, right? It's not just, when everybody else is talking about it. I could go on for a long time, but yes, it's about action. It's about, getting uncomfortable within yourself in terms of the actions that you're willing to do in order to advocate and support other folks.
I think the hardest thing for some allies to learn is to listen. A lot of them want to talk. A lot of them want to give speeches. A lot of them want to be seen or express. And I wish they would just zip it and listen. Invite us in and we'll guide you. We'll hold your hand. It's not hard.
I'll tell, and Dawn, I have to say that you made me think of something a story I tell in the book. One of our executive sponsors at our LGBTQ ERG at New York Life, I was one of the co-founders. I never had one. Then I come out, and then all of a sudden, all this stuff starts happening. Not that I had anything to do with that, but anyway. So he shows up at the meeting, white straight guy, and says, "I'm a white straight guy. I don't know anything, but I want to support you, and I want to be there for you. So help me." So what did I learn from that? It's about being vulnerable too. It's about being able to create space and be comfortable in that vulnerability. Because you know what? You don't know everything. let's just be clear. You don't know everything. I don't know everything. None of us know everything. So let's just be comfortable in that space and let other people share with you so that you can learn. And what he did in that moment was, I wish I could turn it into pixie dust and just like, spread it all over the planet. I swear to God, really. Kath, how are we doing on time? We're
Can't
up
think of a
against it.
more perfect way to end this event and to, I would say end Pride Month, but yes, I have another event tomorrow. So, and I'm sure most of you do as well. I cannot thank Shelley and all the folks at the Museum of PR, all the sponsors, and of course, all of you who took your time to stick it out and for this full event and be here for us and be present. And I want to thank everyone who's attended. And again, every year this gets bigger and bigger and better. And so I can't wait till next year. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Happy Pride.
Take care.
Happy Pride.
All right, happy Pride 12 months a year.
Woohoo!